No one could deny that this was a clever publicity maneuver for Castro. Although Mikoyan said little, his trip to Cuba was more than enough to increase American suspicions about the rebel leader just 90 miles south of the United States. Openly distrustful of the United States, Castro seized upon the explosion of a French munition ship in Havana Harbor in March 1960 to accuse the American government of sabotage. Though the American government denied any involvement, Castro used the funeral for the victims as his stage to lash out at the United States. It was a role he would play to great effect for years to come. Presenting himself as the leader of a vibrant revolution beleaguered by the influence of an enormous hostile neighbor, Castro raised concerns about America's enormous political power that resonated with leaders of liberation movements around the world. In the summer of 1960, with a stroke of his pen, Castro nationalized foreign-owned oil companies, movie theaters, and banks. President Eisenhower, in turn, cut imports of sugar from Cuba and eventually ordered a total trade embargo. In 1958, 70% of all Cuban imports had come from the United States. By 1961, almost none did. As the economic war escalated between the two countries, Castro repudiated the Mutual Assistance Pact that had linked Cuba and the United States. In his anti-American Havana Declaration, he rejected capitalism and imperialism. The rift between the superpower and the island nation would soon gain international attention. In New York to address the United Nations in 1960, Castro took every opportunity to maximize the impact of his visit. Staying in a modest hotel in Harlem, he mingled with the staff, highlighting his regime's dedication to racial tolerance. This, at a time when much of America remained racially segregated. The trip was a platform for denunciations, making contacts, and creating an international reputation for Cuba. Castro openly and warmly embraced Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. At the United Nations, he spoke on behalf of oppressed people around the world, while haranguing the United States whenever possible. Castro's anti-American diatribe went on for 4 hours and 26 minutes. It was the longest speech ever delivered at the UN. Many in the audience were from countries that had recently shed their colonial rulers. Castro's stance against imperialists and neo-colonialism found a ready audience among the Third World diplomats, as well as liberal intellectuals and Cuba's vast peasantry. Returning to Cuba, Castro savored what he knew had been an amazing publicity coup for his revolution. But publicity alone was not enough to ensure that the Cuban Revolution would survive the challenges that awaited it. Castro's long battle to protect his revolution and his own position was just beginning. As the leader of revolutionary Cuba, Fidel Castro was determined to provide health care for all Cuban citizens and to end illiteracy among the poor. Castro believed that knowing how to read was a fundamental human right and a revolutionary duty of every Cuban. The nation was mobilized to teach those who did not know how to read. Those who learned to read and write were awarded a diploma by the Revolution. Castro succeeded in effectively eliminating illiteracy in Cuba. One of the consequences Castro may not have imagined was that it also opened the way for his exiled opponents in the United States to leaflet Cuba with anti-Castro literature. Leaflets gave way to small raids by Cuban exiles who were backed by America's intelligence agencies. On April 17, 1961, 1,200 anti-Castro Cuban exiles who had been trained and financed by the Central Intelligence Agency staged an invasion at the Bay of Pigs in southwestern Cuba. The CIA expected that the invasion would set off a massive rebellion against Castro's regime, but the opposite result was achieved. Castro himself participated in the assault against the invaders. The invasion and anticipated insurrection turned into a military fiasco for the exiles. Badly briefed, the CIA had chosen the worst place to land, a swamp area with hardly any firm ground. More than 90% of the invasion force was taken prisoner. The CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion was all the proof Castro needed to show that the United States was committed to his overthrow. Confident after his victory at the Bay of Pigs, Castro authorized the secret installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. Neither he nor Soviet leader Khrushchev believed that President Kennedy, who had failed to come to the rescue of the Bay of Pigs forces, would react. Detected by American spy planes, the missiles were capable of reaching targets in the continental United States within minutes. President Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove the nuclear threat. Of 1 week, American-Soviet relations were extremely tense, with the United States military preparing for war. Never before had the world been so close to a nuclear confrontation. Finally, at the end of October, Khrushchev was the first to blink in this nuclear stare-down. He announced that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles. Castro, uninformed of the Soviet leader's decision, was infuriated at the backdown. Despite his rhetoric to the contrary, it was perhaps his first realization that he was a pawn in the global confrontation between East and West.
Let no one imagine that the withdrawal of strategic weapons disarms us.
The removal of the Soviet weapons was an intense humiliation for Castro. He considered giving up his leadership role in Cuba. Isolated from the Western community, Castro became increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union. During a visit to Moscow in 1964, Castro put aside his differences with Khrushchev over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Together, they played in the snow along with the Soviet leader's future successor, Leonid Brezhnev. The Soviets, after all, had just agreed to buy Cuban sugar at a higher than world market rate. Castro could not afford to bear grudges. Cuba was on its way to becoming the Soviet Union's very own sugar bowl.